An elderly black man named Walter Davis slowly walked through the glass doors of a Huntington Bank branch. He wore a gray hoodie with holes at the sleeves and beat-up sneakers that looked like they'd seen 1,000 miles. His gray, tangled hair stuck out from under an old cap, and he clutched a worn-out backpack covered in dirt stains. Walter stopped in the middle of the lobby, where the fans hummed overhead, and took a look around. The people nearby, mostly white, dressed in crisp shirts or holding briefcases, gave him quick glances before turning away, like he was just part of the scenery they'd rather ignore. He took a step forward and said loudly, "This bank belongs to me by right." His voice, low and steady, cut through the room, making everyone freeze for a second. Then came a snort from a woman in a beige suit holding an expensive bag. A guy in glasses chuckled next, and soon the whole lobby filled with quiet, snarky laughter. "You for real, old man," a guy in a Buckeyes t-shirt tossed out, standing by the check counter. Walter didn't answer, just stared straight ahead, like he'd heard it all before in his 75 years. The security guard, a tall white guy named Kevin Reed, started walking toward him right away. His face showed annoyance mixed with a hint of mockery. "Listen, Grandpa, you don't belong here, so head back outside," he said, resting a hand on his belt where a holstered gun sat. Kevin was used to dealing with folks like Walter, poorly dressed, black, clearly not from a decent part of town. But Walter didn't even glance at him. He set his backpack down on the smooth tiled floor and started unzipping it slowly. "I said this bank's mine, and I've got proof," he repeated, keeping his voice even but firm enough that the laughter in the crowd started to fade. People exchanged looks, some pulling out phones to record whatever this was. The woman in the beige suit, named Laura Bennett, crossed her arms and muttered to the guy next to her, probably another bum who thinks he's owed something here. Her neighbor, a man in a gray blazer, nodded, gripping his briefcase tighter, like Walter might snatch it any second. Behind the counter, a cashier, a 28-year-old guy named Ethan Clark, leaned over to his co-worker and mumbled, "Check it out, another nutcase who thinks he's a millionaire." His partner, a girl with long auburn hair named Haley, smirked. "Yeah, guys like him always make up stories to get pity," she said, tossing Walter a look full of disdain. Both were white, raised in the quiet suburbs of Columbus, and figured old black men in rags belonged to some other world. Walter finally got the backpack open, and the crowd went quiet, craning their necks to see what was inside. Kevin stepped closer, his hand still on the holster, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Last time I'm telling you, old man, get out before I throw you out," he barked, but his voice wavered, like he wasn't so sure anymore. Walter pulled out an old folder with frayed edges, held it up, and said, "These papers prove I founded this bank in 1945. Silence dropped over the lobby like a heavy blanket. The laughter stopped, and even Laura quit whispering. Everyone stared at Walter at that folder, and the air buzzed with one question: what if he's not lying? A phone rang somewhere, but no one moved to pick it up. Walter stood there, folder in hand, his tired but sharp eyes glinting. He knew this was just the start, the reason he'd come here after all those years of silence. And everyone in that lobby felt it. This old man they'd taken for a joke might be something way bigger. In the Huntington Bank lobby in Columbus, tension hung in the air like thick fog before a storm. Walter Davis stood with a worn folder in his hands, his gaze steady despite dozens of eyes locked on him. People around whispered, some still chuckling, but most couldn't look away from the backpack at his feet. The security guard, Kevin Reed, gripping his holster, took another step forward, his face red with irritation. "You think you can just walk in here with some old folder and turn this into a circus?" he snapped, trying to sound confident, though his voice shook a little. Walter didn't answer right away. He slowly dropped to one knee and started untying a second knot on the backpack. "I'm not making a circus. I'm here for what's mine," he said quietly, but each word landed in the silence like a rock in water. Kevin snorted, glanced at the crowd for backup, but only saw curious faces. Laura Bennett, the woman in the beige suit, stepped back, her lips pressed into a thin line. "This is getting ridiculous. Someone call the manager already," she said louder than necessary, clearly hoping to take charge of the mess. Ethan Clark, the cashier behind the counter, turned to Haley and muttered, "If he pulls out something weird, I'm not sticking around to deal with it." Haley nodded, her eyes narrowing. "Yeah, guys like him always think they can scare us with their sob stories," she replied, but her voice betrayed a hint of unease. They'd both grown up in families where black folks from poor neighborhoods were seen as lazy or con artists, and now their comfy worldview was starting to crack. Walter finally opened the backpack wider, revealing old papers tied with twine and a few yellowed envelopes. He carefully pulled out one, its faded ink spelling something nobody could read yet. "These are from when the bank started," he said, holding the envelope up for everyone to see. The crowd went quiet. Even Kevin froze, his hand still on the holster, but his fingers loosened a bit. Someone in the back whispered, "No way, is this for real?" And it was like tossing fuel on the fire of curiosity. Kevin stepped closer, leaned down to peek at the papers, then straightened up with a smirk. "You think these old scraps mean anything?" "I'll call the cops and they'll sort you out," he said, but the confidence in his tone was fading. Walter looked up at him, his dark, deep eyes locking with the guard's. "Call whoever you want, but the truth won't go away," he replied calmly, and there was a strength in his voice nobody could brush off. Laura pulled out her phone and started dialing, but her fingers shook. "This is insane. Someone needs to stop this nonsense," she said, turning to the man in the gray blazer beside her. He shrugged, unsure what to think. "Maybe he's just crazy, or maybe he's not," he mumbled, watching Walter with growing interest. Just then, the bank manager, a 40-something woman named Rachel Thornton, stepped out from behind the counter. Her black hair was tied in a neat bun, and her face showed a mix of exhaustion and annoyance. "What's going on here, Kevin? Why is everyone standing around staring?" she asked, walking closer. Kevin turned to her, pointing at Walter. "This old guy says the bank's his and keeps waving some papers around," he said, trying to sound sarcastic, but doubt crept into his voice. Rachel glanced at Walter, then at the backpack, and her brows furrowed. "Sir, if you've got a complaint, you need to take it to the legal department, not put on a show here," she said coldly, crossing her arms over her chest. Walter stood up slowly, holding the envelope in his hands. "I'm not putting on a show. I'm here to prove you stole from me over 50 years ago," he said, and his words hung in the air like a dare. Rachel opened her mouth to reply, but stopped when Walter started untying the twine on the envelope. Everyone held their breath, even Kevin, whose hand now dangled at his side. Something about this old man, his calmness and stubbornness, made them all question what they thought they knew about the world. In the Huntington Bank lobby in Columbus, the silence got so thick you could almost touch it as Walter Davis untied the twine on his old envelope. His movements were slow but sure, like he'd been waiting his whole life for this. The crowd around held their breath. Even Kevin Reed, the guard with his hand near his holster, didn't budge, though his face still twisted with doubt. Rachel Thornton, the bank manager, stood with a stone-cold look, but her eyes darted nervously from Walter to the papers he held. People in line quit whispering, stretching their necks to see what he'd pull out. Walter took out a stack of old documents, yellowed from age, with seals you could barely make out. He held them up higher and said, "These are the original papers from 1945, when I founded this bank." His voice stayed even, but you could feel the weight of years in it. Then he pulled out something else, a small notebook with a beat-up cover that read, "Huntington Ledger." "And this is the first account book, with my signature on every page," he added, flipping it open to show faded ink lines still readable. The crowd gasped. Some even stepped back, like those papers might burn them. Laura Bennett, the woman in the beige suit, clutched her bag and muttered, "This has to be some kind of prank. No way this is real." But her voice shook, and she didn't even believe herself. Ethan Clark, the cashier, leaned over to Haley and whispered, "If this is legit, we're all screwed big time." Haley just nodded, her face pale, looking less sure of her sarcasm for once. Kevin stepped forward, trying to take back control. "Come on, old man, you think we're buying this crap?" he said, but it sounded weak, and he glanced at Rachel like he needed her to step in. Walter looked at him and said calmly, "Believe it or not, here's proof I'm Walter Davis, the guy who laid this bank's first brick." He pointed at a page in the notebook where his signature sat next to another, Frank Mills, his old partner. Rachel walked closer, her heels clicking on the tile, and grabbed the notebook from Walter's hands. She flipped through a couple pages, her fingers trembling a little, then looked up at him. "If this is true, then why have I never heard of you in the bank's history?" she asked, trying to sound firm, but uncertainty slipped through. Walter gave a small laugh, no anger in it. "Because they erased me as soon as they could, all because I'm black," he said, and his words hit the silence like a hammer on steel. Laura snorted, but quieter this time. "That's ridiculous. A black man couldn't start a bank back then," she said, then shut up when the guy in a gray blazer next to her mumbled, "Actually, it happens sometimes, they just don't talk about it." Rachel glanced at him, then back at Walter, and her face started to pale. She knew the bank's history, or thought she did, and now everything she believed was falling apart right in front of her. Walter pulled another sheet from the stack, a letter from Frank Mills, dated 1947. Here he writes he wanted to buy me out, but I said no, he said, handing it to Rachel. She took it, read the first lines, and her hands shook harder. They said I couldn't handle it, that a black guy didn't belong running a bank, and kicked me out, Walter went on, looking straight at her. Then they rewrote the papers and wiped my name out. Kevin clenched his fists, his face turning redder. This is all garbage. You're just an old liar, he blurted, but he stepped back, like he wasn't sure anymore. Rachel raised a hand to stop him. Hold on, Kevin, let me figure this out, she said, and for the first time, her voice lost its chill, showing only confusion. She looked at Walter, at the notebook, at the letter, and realized this old man had just flipped her world upside down. Everyone in the lobby knew a storm was coming, and nobody could guess how it'd end. Rachel Thornton held the old notebook and letter in her hands, her face pale, fingers trembling a bit as she reread Walter's signature next to Frank Mills's name. The crowd started whispering, some pulling out phones to record, others just standing there, unsure what to think. Kevin Reed, the guard, clenched his fists and stepped toward Walter, his eyes burning with anger. You think you can just walk in here and tear down everything we know? He snapped, trying to sound threatening, but his voice gave away confusion. Walter looked at him calmly, his face staying still. I'm not tearing anything down. I'm taking back what they stole from me, he said, and there was a strength in his words Kevin didn't expect. Rachel raised a hand to stop the guard. Kevin, enough, let me handle this, she said, her voice shaky but trying to stay steady. She turned to Walter and asked, if everything you're saying is true, then why'd you wait so long to come here? The question hung there, and everyone waited for his answer. Walter sighed, his gaze drifting like he was back in the past. I tried fighting back then in 1947, but nobody listened to a black man against white guys with money, he started, his voice quieter, but every word clear. I went to courts, showed these papers, but they told me I was making it up, that I didn't belong in that business. He paused, looking at Rachel. They took everything, the bank, my share, even my name, and left me with nothing. The crowd went silent. Some looked down, feeling awkward. Laura Bennett, the woman in the beige suit, crossed her arms and said, this all sounds like a fairy tale. Where's the proof they didn't just fire you for screwing up? Her tone was sharp, but doubt flickered in her eyes. Walter nodded at the papers in Rachel's hands. It's all their letters, signatures, even notes from Frank admitting I was a partner, he replied, and Laura shut up, out of comebacks. Behind the counter, Ethan Clark, the cashier, turned to Haley and whispered, if this is real, the bosses will fire us all over this mess. Haley frowned but didn't snap back with sarcasm this time. Maybe he's not lying, but it's not our problem, she said, though her voice sounded unsure. They both felt their usual biases cracking, but weren't ready to admit it. Then a young bank employee, a 25-year-old girl named Caitlin Morris, stepped out of the crowd. Her blonde hair was tied in a ponytail, and her face showed a mix of fear and resolve. She walked up to Walter and said quietly, I believe you, Mr. Davis. It's not fair what they did to you. Her voice shook, but she stood tall looking at him. Rachel stared at her, surprised. Caitlin, do you realize what you're saying? She asked, but the girl nodded. I've read about old banks, and sometimes they mention black owners getting pushed out, Caitlin said, her words catching everyone off guard. Ethan and Haley exchanged looks, their faces dropping in shock. Kevin snorted, but softer now. What, you're a historian now, he tossed out, but Caitlin ignored him, just looking at Walter with respect. Then another employee, a 30-year-old guy named Nathan Green with a short haircut, stepped up. I believe it too, it sounds like the truth, he said, his voice firm. Rachel gripped the notebook tighter, her face tense. If this is true, it's a huge scandal, and I don't know how we'll deal with it, she said, looking at Walter. He nodded, his eyes shining. I don't want a scandal. I want you to admit what you did to me, he replied, and his words made everyone freeze. Everyone knew Walter's truth was gaining ground, and stopping it wouldn't be easy. Walter Davis stood in the middle of the crowd, his old backpack at his feet, his gaze steady despite the years of weariness in his eyes. Rachel Thornton clutched the notebook and letter, her face showing not just confusion now, but something close to shame. Kevin Reed, the guard, stepped back, his fists unclenched, and his hands stayed away from the holster. The support from Caitlin Morris and Nathan Green, two employees, shifted the room's vibe. People started glancing at each other, whispers growing louder. Rachel looked at Walter and took a deep breath. Mr. Davis, I don't know how to sort this all out, but I can't just brush off what you've shown us, she said, her voice quieter than before, but carrying a new honesty. She turned to Kevin and added, drop your hand, we're not kicking anyone out until we figure this out. Kevin frowned, his face red with frustration, but he nodded and stepped back more, clearly not wanting to argue with the manager. Walter nodded back, his lips twitching into a faint smile. "I don't expect you to fix it all in a day, but I want you to know the truth," he said, looking at Rachel, then the crowd. "They erased me from history because I was black, and I've lived with that for over 50 years. His words hung there, and some in the crowd looked down, like they were thinking about what he'd been through for the first time. Laura Bennett, the woman in the beige suit, cleared her throat and said, "Well, if this is true, it's not our fault. We're just customers here." Her voice was weaker than before, and she sounded like she was making excuses. The guy in the gray blazer next to her shook his head. "Maybe not ours, but someone did it, and he's standing right in front of us," he replied, nodding at Walter. Laura went quiet, her cheeks flushing a bit, and she turned away. Caitlin stepped closer to Walter and said, "I'll talk to the staff. We can check the archives and dig up more if it's there." Her voice was soft but firm, and she glanced at Nathan, who nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I'll help too. This can't just stay talk," he added, and his support gave Walter more confidence. Ethan Clark and Haley behind the counter exchanged looks, their faces showing irritation and unease. "If this is real, we're toast," Ethan whispered, but Haley just shrugged. "Maybe not toast, but definitely a headache," she replied under her breath. Rachel set the notebook on the counter and looked at Walter. "I promise we'll look into it, but it'll take time, and I can't guarantee everyone will buy it," she said, her tone getting more serious. Walter nodded, his eyes shining with held-back feelings. "I don't need everyone to buy it. I need you to admit what happened," he replied, and his voice cracked for the first time that day. Rachel swallowed, realizing this moment meant more to him than she could grasp. Kevin muttered something to himself, then said out loud, "I still think this is too weird to be true." He crossed his arms, but his look wasn't as angry anymore, more tired. Rachel glanced at him and said, "Maybe it's weird, but we can't ignore these papers." She turned to Walter and added, "I'll start with a check, and we'll see what we can do." It wasn't a promise of miracles, but a first step, and Walter got that. The crowd started breaking up, some still whispering, others just leaving, but you could feel something had shifted. Walter bent down to grab his backpack and looked at Caitlin and Nathan. "Thanks for believing me. That's more than I hoped for," he said quietly, his voice full of gratitude. Caitlin smiled and Nathan nodded. Walter Davis walked slowly toward the exit. His old backpack hung on his shoulder, beat up, but now feeling like more than just a thing, a symbol of something bigger. The crowd had thinned out, leaving behind a hum of voices and a few glances that followed him to the glass doors. Rachel Thornton stood at the counter, still holding the notebook, her face a mix of tiredness and thoughtfulness. Caitlin Morris and Nathan Green watched him go, their eyes shining with quiet respect. Walter stopped at the doors, put a hand on the handle, and turned back. He looked at Rachel and said, "I don't know what you'll find in your records, but I'm glad someone heard me today." His voice was soft, but it carried the strength of a man who'd finally dropped a lifetime of silence. Rachel nodded, her lips pressing into a small smile. "We'll check everything we can, Mr. Davis, that's a promise," she replied, and her tone lost its old chill, replaced with honesty. Kevin Reed stood off to the side, arms crossed, his face still frowning, but he didn't argue anymore. "If this is true, I don't even know what to say," he mumbled, staring at the floor, his words sounding like he'd given up. Walter looked at him and said, "You don't have to say anything, just think about why you got so mad at me." Kevin glanced up, said nothing, his cheeks turning red, and looked away. Caitlin walked up to the counter and said to Rachel, "I'll start looking for old records tomorrow. Maybe something's left from back then." Nathan nodded and added, "I'm in too. This is too big to just let go." Rachel looked at them and said, "Fine, but get ready for the bosses to hate this mess." She knew the Hillman family, who'd owned the bank for decades, wouldn't go down easy, but now it wasn't just her call. Walter pushed the door open and stepped outside, where warm August air hit him with a light breeze. He stopped on the sidewalk, staring at the bank he'd once built with his own hands. His eyes, tired but alive, glinted in the sun, and for the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe free. People passed by not knowing who he was, but Walter didn't care. He knew he'd left his mark inside. Back in the bank, Rachel turned to the staff and said, "If we find anything, this'll hit the news, and we'll all have to answer for it." Caitlin nodded, her face serious. "I'm ready, it's worth it," she replied, and Nathan added, "We can't pretend nothing happened." Ethan Clark and Haley stood quiet, their usual smirks gone. If this is real, we look like idiots, Ethan whispered, and Haley just sighed. Maybe we do, but it's too late to back out now, she said under her breath. The next day, Walter's story started spreading around Columbus. One of the customers posted a video online, and local reporters jumped on it. The Hillman family put out a statement saying they'd look into it, but their tone was sharp, like they were already gearing up to fight. Walter sat at home in his small apartment on the edge of town, watching the news on an old TV. He didn't smile, but his eyes were calm. He knew the battle was just starting, but the first step was done. A week later, Rachel found an old record in the archives about a partner named Walter Davis, scratched out in pencil. She called Caitlin and Nathan, and they started digging deeper. Walter's story turned into a symbol in the city, not just about a bank, but about how truth can break through years of lies. He didn't want apologies or cash. It was enough that they'd heard him. Walter stepped onto his porch, looked at the sunset, and thought maybe his name would stick in history now, like it should have all along. Now, some questions for you viewers. What would you do if you found out your job was built on someone's stolen life? Would you bow to the bosses or stand up for the truth like Caitlin and Nathan? Drop your answers in the comments. Don't hold back. I really want to know what you think. If this story got to you, share it with your friends. Let them chew on it too. Thanks for sticking with me,